Of course, your friends and loved ones care deeply about you, but if you're honest, while they mean well, when it comes to your divorce, they just don't get it. And sometimes you leave those conversations feeling even more isolated. If you're lonely and craving connection, support, and practical guidance, check out our High Conflict Divorce Support Group, where we gather regularly from the comfort of our homes. Facilitated by Eran Magen, you will feel heard, seen, encouraged, and powerfully guided in the emotional and practical steps ahead. Go to jbddivorcesupport.com/HCDSG and register today. Welcome back to another episode. Today we're talking about divorcing dads, expert strategies for thriving through divorce. And as many of you know, divorcing dads are at significantly higher risk for mental health challenges, including depression and even suicide, compared to other men. And the combination of the emotional upheaval, the societal expectations, and the fears around losing contact with their children can take such a serious toll on divorcing men. This episode dives into why fathers face such unique and daunting challenges during divorce and how they can emerge stronger and more connected than ever. And with me today, I'm so excited to chat with Dr. Eran Magen. Did I say that right?
Magen.
And so with me today, I'm so excited to speak to Dr. Eran Magen, an expert in parenting and mental health with a background from Stanford and Yale. And he's the founder of divorcingdads.org. You want to check it out. And parentingforhumans.com. He's dedicated his career to empowering fathers to navigate divorce with strength and wisdom. With no further ado, welcome, Eran.
Thank you very much, Karen.
This is a conversation I love to have my listeners know that I have a history with my dad and struggles, and I'm excited for where we're going to go. Before we dive in, I love for my guests to share something interesting and unique about themselves that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your 9-to-5 job. What do you have for us?
Yeah, you were kind enough to give me a slight heads up before we started recording. So I thought ferociously, and I'll say that I have a couple of hobbies that I don't think are completely weird, but I don't think are very common. And after some time, I realized there's a common thread between them. So I really like playing music and singing with other people. That's just a huge source of joy and connection for me. I play guitar, I play some harmonica, I play some percussion, and just figuring out harmonies with other people especially is amazing. And then there are other versions of this that are physical to my mind, right? So like I dance Argentine tango, I play acro yoga, if you know what that is. It's like grown-ups balancing on each other, basically. And all of those things to me are really about harmony, about figuring out how to move or sing or do something in relation to another person. And it's just such a source of joy for me to experience this kind of coordination. So this is my smattering of hobbies and the connecting thread that I see through them.
Yeah, I love the connecting thread. It's like connection and harmony, which is just beautiful. And I'm always envious of people who have musical abilities because I feel like it just lights up one's soul to just connect and sing or play and make music in the world. So that's beautiful.
Yeah, I love it. It's such a different way of connecting too. I mean, there's no words, there's no content, right? It's not intellectual. It's operating on a very different level. It's just so inherently satisfying. Yeah, I love it.
Beautiful. And it sounds like a nice juxtaposition to the sometimes heavy work that you do.
Um, yes and no. In a way, it fits because I don't think of my work as having to do with being adversarial or trying to operate from adversarial viewpoints. Even when I'm working with divorcing dads, I'm always looking toward how do we reduce conflict? How do we live well inside conflict and disengage from the conflict if it exists? How do we prioritize time and connection and engagement with the kids to their benefits and to ours? So it feels related. And I'll say in the activities that I enjoy, I also do a lot of martial arts. I've done martial arts since I was in third grade. And that too is a way of relating. You have to be very aware of what the person in front of you is doing, whether you're playing with them collaboratively, like in acro yoga or in improv, or whether you're engaging with them adversarially or at least competitively. We're not trying to hurt each other when we're training, really. But the mindset is different, but still it requires actually the same level of awareness and coordination and caution with the other person and realizing that if I do something extreme, you're going to react to something extreme. And so there's a way to de-escalate, even in situations that are easily perceived as nothing but conflict. But even within conflict, there are still rules, even when we think, oh, the other person is totally out of control and totally doing whatever they want to do and they're totally disregarding. No, everybody's aware of some lines and we can always cross them if we're not careful and then escalate. So anyhow, all this, a very long way to say, yes, it definitely recharges me and energizes me to do these things that I love. And I see them as very much connected to how do we live in relation to other people rather than only tag it as conflict and nothing else.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for letting me immediately start blabbering on.
So, how did divorcingdads.org originate?
When I was in graduate school for psychology, I got very interested in how people support people, just people who are not clinically trained, just normal people. What do you do when you meet somebody and they're in a bad mood? How do you support them? And I started doing more and more work on this. And eventually this morphed into my very strong interest in parenting and how to form strong and supportive relationships with kids. I've been doing workshops and sessions and classes for parents for, I don't know, over a decade now, maybe 15 years, usually through school districts. So that was one line of work. And then another line of work was this company that I started some years ago that works with universities on suicide prevention. We check in with students individually once a week through text messaging, see how they're doing. And if they're not doing so well, we start bringing support resources on board, just early intervention type of work. And a lot of my thinking ends up getting split between parenting and parents and suicide prevention. And usually the two are separate, but there's obviously areas of overlap. Both some concerns for the parents, often a lot of concern for the kids. But really, how do you establish strong supportive relationships in all of these different contexts? I went through my own process of separation from my son's mom, and it was very tough for me. And so the first few years were really just very, very hard. And I leaned extremely hard on my friends and felt so grateful to them as this was happening. And just feel very lucky to have had these relationships in place and with these particular people who were, again, just so incredibly supportive. And still, it was incredibly tough, very, very difficult years. And part of the way that I make meaning when I go through something awful is I start writing down what I'm learning in order to make it easier for the next person who's coming down that same trail. And then I tell myself, well, at least this is helping somebody, or maybe we'll help more people down the line. And once I got my head above water in my own process and organized my notes and started sharing them with people and got very positive feedback and realized two things. One, there are very few resources available for men going through this. And two, this is really bad for men in particular, right? Because as I was going into the research and realizing the increased risk that you were talking about before, and the increased risk for death by suicide, which is really just very marked, about double any other marital status category. If you're going through a divorce as a man, your risk of suicide jumps by at least two. And so I thought this seems like a good thing to focus on. I want to help men who are going through this process stay healthy and stay sane and stay connected to their kids, because I think that's so important to the kids as well, to have a good connection with a positive, functioning, more or less happy, less or more happy father. I think it's just good for everybody. And in the process, figure out how to de-escalate the relationship with the ex-spouse. Just everybody wins. And really, I started doing thinking about the kids. I think the relationship between a parent and a child is the most important relationship in the world. I think most of the world's trouble would probably be a lot less if everybody had good relationships with their parents. And so this is what I'm orienting toward. And this is a way of helping this high risk group of parents at risk not only regarding their own well-being, but also at risk in terms of their relationship with their kids. This is a way of helping this high-risk group of parents stay connected to their kids in a really positive way that hopefully prevents bad things from happening. So it started because of this overlap in interests and then my own personal experience. They all came together in a way that seems completely obvious in hindsight.
Yeah, yeah, really beautiful convergence of the different interests, the parenting, the suicide concern, and then your own experience. So let's talk about when you think about men going through divorce, what would you say are the top 3 to 5 biggest fears, triggers, concerns that you work with most of the time?
Fear of, so this is not arranged exactly in order, but I would say top five are fear of losing connection with their kids, becoming estranged from the kids, basically. Fear about losing money. Number three is struggling with a change in self-perception, which I would divide into two. One is a lot of times men in high conflict separations or divorces get so much negative messaging about themselves. And I often see them really struggling with it for the first little while, I would say 6 to 18 months, wondering if they really are very bad people and just
Yep.
trying to work through that. And then the other half of it is wondering who they are outside the context of a family, which for many men is really the main thing that exists in their life outside of work. So these are the big four ones, I would say. And then the fifth is then, well, what happens next? Am I going to have another relationship, another family? How can this possibly happen? Initially, it's who might want me. Later on, it's who do I want to be with? I would say these are the big five.
Yeah,
What do you
absolutely.
think? Does that jive with your experience?
Completely, completely. I think that I probably would put money a little further down for a lot of the people I deal with, but I think the losing the kids or losing that connection, or a lot of my clients are worried about the safety of the kids once they leave. Like that's something that has kept a lot of them. It's like, I need to stay because emotionally things are so chaotic or conflict oriented at home. Self perception, absolutely. The who am I think is such a big thing. And I think in your statement about that, you touched on something I want to dive into, which is how much support women have. And us girls, we've been chatting and connecting with each other since really early. We get really deep, we go vulnerable, we get emotional. You need someone to talk to. You usually have a handful of BFFs you can call. And guys, and my dad, my son, my husband, they would get together with their friends and come back, and it'd be like they knew what the football stats were. They knew who liked what team. But when
Yeah.
you would ask them about like things outside of that, it seemed more limited. And so I feel like society has given men this, and I know it's changing, but slowly this pull up your boots by your bootstraps and have a stiff upper lip and don't get emotional and boys don't cry and all this stuff that has when you're in the vice of something like divorce and especially high conflict divorce does not serve men at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's worth adding, this is on average, right? I mean, there are lots of guys that have good close friends, and there are quite a few women that don't have any confidants. But yeah, on average, I think women have such a better developed support system, close, vulnerable relationships than men do for sure.
And then you add the professional realm where, like you said, you didn't have a lot of support. There aren't a lot of male divorce coaches out there. And I have found, which is why I was so excited to have you on, that when I'm creating content for men and I go and I look, it's like it's so sparse. And especially my particular interest in abused spouses, abused men, it's like this dirty secret that's hidden behind a curtain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's dive in. Let's dive into the kids, this whole concept of losing the kids and the kind of narratives that your clients and maybe mine get from their wives that make them scared that they would lose the kids. Like, what does that sound like coming from your clients?
Usually, separation starts when the woman in the relationship, again, typically on average, and I think most commonly, the women will plan and initiate the separation and arrive at it like very well prepared, like having already developed a lot of internal velocity. And the men are just in shock initially. This is a common story. It's not 100% of the time at all, but this is a common story. And maybe men ignore the signs that things are really bad, or even actual explicit things that the soon-to-be ex is saying, like this is really not working out. We should really, and eventually says, I'm done. And then the men are very surprised and then have to start dealing with it. And the very first thing that happens is a separation of residences. And when this happens, almost all the time, the kids are with the mom, one way or another. Many men want to be considerate at this point, are trying to be helpful, saying, okay, I'll move out. The kids can stay in the home. So they're in a place that they're used to. You can stay with them. So through one path or another, it's almost always the case that the kids stay with the mom initially. And one thing that I've seen repeatedly, and again, I'd be curious to hear how that jives with your experience, but it seems that status quo is king. Everything having to do with family affairs and family law. The system as a whole is very reluctant to change status quos. And so once something gets established, it's canonized really quickly. So if the kids are with the mom and the dad is living in some little rented apartment somewhere, the dad then has to really work very hard to get time with the kids if the mom isn't interested in doing that. Because you can't break into the house and you can't take the kids away from school without the mom's agreement, or you could, but things go south like, very fast. And I think that's inadvisable to do stuff like that and bad for the kids. And so the kids are just with the mom. And at this point, it's an uphill climb and it becomes a serious point of contention. And at that point, when people lose a sense of the importance of guardrails, accusations can start flying really fast.
Mm-hmm.
One person will say you're not safe for the kids. Another will say you don't care about the kids. Another will say the kids like tell me that they're afraid of being with you. And it just becomes worse and worse and worse really quickly. And if you're in a situation like this and you're the person who's not the one who's caring for the kids by default, which is typically the mom initially, then you're cut off basically. And it can certainly feel like you're at the mercy of the mom in that situation, whether or not she'll give you access to the kids. And then you're facing a choice. Do you go to court? Do you go to police? Do you, like where do you even start? In the meantime, time is ticking and I'm not seeing the kids. And what are they hearing when they're at home with her? And everybody's really worried about parental alienation, whether or not it's actually happening. It's actually, I think, fairly rare that it really happens, but it does happen sometimes. And so everybody's really worried about it.
Yep.
So I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, I have a number of different comments I'd like to put on the table to talk about. Your kids may not be the only ones taking tests this year. SoberLink is the #1 alcohol monitoring device on the market for parents who need to prove their sobriety. Here's how it works. Your co-parent will test at scheduled times each day. Built-in facial recognition confirms their identity. Tamper sensors flag any attempts to cheat. And results get sent instantly to your phone. So you know your kids are with a sober parent, whether it's during school nights or weekends away. Set your family up for success this school year. Visit soberlink.com/JBD to learn more and get $50 off your device. Are you looking for a way to make co-parenting easier? Talking Parents can help you streamline your shared parenting responsibilities and minimize conflict by keeping all interactions organized and documented. With Talking Parents, you can stop worrying about the he said, she said, and focus on what matters most, your children. Download the app in the Apple or Google Play Store and start a 30-day free trial today. In my own divorce, I wasn't allowed to leave the house because if I left the house and got an apartment, my spouse could go to school, pick up the kids, and be the primary parent. So I had to stay for 3.5 years in the attic.
With both of you living at the same house?
Yeah. And especially in today's day and age where money is tight for so many,
Yeah.
a lot of people live under the same roof until they're divorced. And I would even say, as you tell that story, most of the people who come to us, men and women, are the ones making the decision. Not always, but very often. And you're right. And I give my men the exact same guidance I give my women, which is be quiet, get ready, get your head, heart, and home in order before you dive in so that you're not upside down through half of this. And so it makes sense to me that women, or men and women, who know enough to get the guidance and education early on, one of the key things would be, can you leave your marital home? And what happens if you, these are conversations I have early on. Um, is there an attorney you can at least consult with? Because if you leave the marital home, are you setting something up? And so if one doesn't know that, to your point, and they're just trying to do the right thing because mom is so upset and they want to give her space. And I think that the key here is, when you're entering divorce, to do anything without first learning your legal rights is unadvisable. It's such a beginning of such a big transition. You might still decide to move out, but at least you're doing it with the knowledge. And, well, do I have to get a temporary parenting order in place? Or what else do I have to do before I go forward? And so it makes so much sense that you've been told that your wife wants a divorce. You go and find a place thinking you're doing the right thing, and you find yourself behind the eight ball, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think it's such a bind, right? For those of us that want to keep things non-adversarial, the idea of starting to make all these like strategic decisions instead of assuming that we'll talk it over and it'll be okay, it already feels like, okay, now am I the one escalating? What's happening here? This is a terrible bind to be in as a person who is seeking to avoid conflict or to de-escalate. I think there are ways around it, but they require sophistication. I guess I should mention, because we're coming into this in a particular framework, right? We're talking about high conflict, divorce,
And
or
we can broaden it
separation.
to
And
all divorce because it is quite
yeah,
different when you've got a garden variety divorce.
yeah. And I think it's important to focus on high conflict sometimes and to talk about what to do in those situations. And I think it's also just at the same time, when talking about it, it's very important to say it's so much better to avoid high conflict divorce. It's possible to get divorced without high conflict. It's possible to disagree strongly and even dislike the other person and still have a collaborative divorce. Divorce that is high conflict is really bad for everybody. It's not good for anything except lawyers. It's just so, so bad. It's so damaging for the kids, for the parents' families. It's so much better to avoid it and work collaboratively. Again, even if you dislike the person. And of course, prevention is the best thing to do. But if we're in a situation where one person knows that they want to separate or have a divorce and the other person is just caught unawares, then you're just operating in a fog. And I think it is very reasonable then, as a first piece of advice, is do exactly what you said, which is stop. Don't act before thinking. Say, I need a week to process this. I can absolutely live in the attic this week, but I need to process this. And then as you're processing this, start talking to people and talk to people who know what they're saying. And maybe go talk to a mediator on your own or to a lawyer on your own, or maybe find a collaborative divorce lawyer, non-adversarial legal practice. Some states have them, and I think they're really cool, where both partners sign on to work with the lawyer or with separate lawyers, but there's an agreement. There's a clause in the agreement that says that if anybody goes to court, all of the work stops with this lawyer. The lawyer cannot represent you in legal proceedings, and that's an amazing guardrail on a legal relationship like that. So,
Absolutely. The
yeah,
collaborative approach really is encased in a commitment to avoid court.
yeah. And I
Um,
think that's just so helpful. So it's ideal, and I wish I knew about this, right, at the time. It's ideal to, as soon as you get the bad news, right, sleep on it or probably have a sleepless night on it. But then the next day, go look for advice and start orienting toward collaborative approaches. And I think as a friend, if your friend calls you and says, I can't believe it, my spouse just said blah, 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 to dispense exactly this advice can
yeah.
be one of the biggest favors you can do to a friend of yours, to say, slow down, stop, orient before doing anything, and immediately start putting this on a collaborative track. Because once you're on a conflict track, things escalate really quickly, really easily when people have high emotions.
Yeah. And I would say that I always give people permission. It's like, you have permission to take time. You just got sideswiped by an 18-wheeler emotionally. You're not going to run a marathon tomorrow. You need some time, and you have every right to tell your spouse that you hear them. And even if you've been in counseling and you know that things have been bumpy, a decision has been made that is a life-changing decision, and you have every right. You're grieving, you're in fight, flight, or freeze. You're not thinking straight. You're going to be angry and sad and everything else. You take the time that you need. That is not stalling. That is not manipulating. That is taking care of yourself. And so I think from the very early stages, I love when people come to us in those very early stages because we can speak reason that sounds really different than what their spouse is telling them, because
Yeah.
their spouse is like, I've been thinking about this for months. Let's get going. Let's hire the mediator or the attorney next week. And it's like, no, just because they're ready doesn't mean that you have to move. And I think that creates such a beautiful space for people to go, oh, that sounds more reasonable. That actually feels better in my heart and my body. How do I do that? She's going to be pushing at me constantly. And then we can
Yeah.
talk
Then you
about,
talk strategy. Yeah.
right, exactly, exactly. So how do you handle it when one person is like that? The other thing I would like to say, because I'm going to disagree with you a little bit here,
Yeah.
I specialize in high conflict, and my clients remain low conflict. They come in saying, I want an amicable divorce, but I've had
Yeah.
this marriage that's been anything but amicable for years or decades. And so I
Yeah.
think that there's a big difference. And I've had many of collaborative attorneys send me clients saying they can't do collaborative because of their spouse. They're not going to be able to. They
Yeah.
have no choice. And so I do think that the majority of people think they're divorcing a narcissist, which is heartbreaking. The majority of people do label their divorce high conflict when divorce has conflict. That's part of the environment that you're in. But there are those people, and they're our entire roster of people who are divorcing someone, whether they're neurodivergent, traumatized, PTSD, personality disorders. They are reasonably inflexible and reactive and don't take ownership. And that you still, my word is, you can still live in peace and joy and have a beautiful life. You just have to be very strategic and very skilled to be able to do it.
Yeah. That's achieving mastery, right? Walking between the drops, or at least knowing when to take an umbrella and not letting the other person's weather impact our lives. Amen to that. Yeah. So
I like the way you said that too. That was a nice metaphor for it.
yeah, I think you and I are in agreement about this, although maybe the way I phrased it before wasn't quite right then. I would say, if and when possible, reduce conflict between people. And yeah, then don't let the other person's,
Right.
weather
Yeah. She
influence
doesn't make
yours.
you feel and she doesn't make you do. You own that. You feel
Yeah.
and you do. And she could be very displeasing, but you are feeling and you are doing, and you need to own that.
Amen. Amen. And in that, I would say also one thing that I see often is people going through divorce have that become their entire identity. And it's true that it's very consuming. And of course, it can be extremely stressful, and you do need to plan and you wonder about implications and you're maybe juggling a few different things, but it just becomes their full identity. Who are you? I'm a divorcing person, right?
Right.
Like it's not great if that's the first thing that you think of when you think about yourself. Maybe it's a thing that's happening for sure,
Right.
right? But even when you're, I don't know, remodeling your kitchen or things that people do, even when you're planning a 10-day backpacking trip, even when you're whatever it is, right? That's not all of you. There's other stuff going on. And so to be able to fit that into the rest of our lives and have that take an appropriate space rather than allow it to completely creep over. I'm thinking about this because of what you said now, right? Because the common first response when I say this is, well, but she's just completely, I'm like, no, no, no. You're the one who's deciding how much time and energy to give this, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's such a good point. I think that it's so overwhelming, and for many it lasts. My longest standing client is going into year 11.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
would say 2 to 3 years for high conflict is
Yeah.
not unusual. And that ability to identify more holistically, I love that perspective. And yeah, divorce is a big part of what I'm dealing with right now, but it's not who I am and what I am. So I want to go back to the kids for a second and maybe give the listeners one or two tips that you give your dads. So you're in this situation, but you're not getting as much time with the kids. Maybe there isn't even a shared parenting plan temporary
Yeah.
in place, or there is and it sucks for you. What are one or two tips you would give dads around that piece of it early on before any final decisions have been made?
First and foremost, let me lay out my assumptions first, right? My assumptions are, in this case, we're talking about a father who wants to be in his kids' lives, wants a strong connection with his kids, and really prioritizes his kids' well-being.
Beautiful.
So I'm starting with that in mind. The first thing that's super important to remember and be reminded of is that it's very hard for kids to disconnect from their parents emotionally. It's extremely unlikely to happen. A lot needs to happen, like a lot more than a lot needs to happen for kids to disconnect emotionally from their parents. Just hardwired. We can't help it. Many of us have had childhoods that were not ideal with parents that were not ideal, and we still are not just in touch with them. We call them when we're upset. We check in with them when they're upset. It's hardwired. And so just to learn to manage the kind of fear or panic that we feel about the looming specter of becoming estranged from our children. It takes a lot. I know plenty of kids who have seen their parents once a month growing up and still consider them to be their parents. We're still connected, still had a relationship with them when they were growing up and after they became adults. I'm not saying that's ideal, but it can happen. So just to learn to decatastrophize is super important. Recognize that your kids in all likelihood, will love you and think of you as their parent, and the relationship can always be improved. If you're not walking away, they're not walking away. And if you're walking away, they still may not walk away, right? They're going to want to be your kids. It's going to take a lot for them to not. So that's the most important thing is to remember this and to be reminded of this, because that's the fear of becoming estranged. It's such a driving fear.
Can you speak for just a second on that? I love that. And I'm just wondering, so for the person who ruminates about losing their kids, talks about losing their kids, tells everyone they're losing their kids, where that is where all of their mental and emotional energy is going, what's the impact of that?
Devastating. For people for whom it's important to have a strong relationship with their kids, absolutely devastating. Because if you think about the psychological definition of trauma, right? Trauma is when a traumatic situation is a situation in which something terrible is happening to us or people we love that we see and are powerless to stop. That's psychological trauma, which may or may not develop into a disorder later. A lot of people go through trauma and then are okay or grow because of it, right? But that's trauma. And to be telling ourselves this story in which the kids are ripped away from us, never to be seen again, and to be constantly watching this movie in our head is basically constantly, repeatedly inflicting this kind of trauma on ourselves and telling us this story to the point that maybe we believe it. Maybe we stop trying. Maybe we give up. Maybe we say, oh, it's too hurtful for them. It's too hurtful for me. Maybe they're better off without me as I'm dealing with my own self-image as I'm going through this, right? All of this. So I think it's really damaging for people to walk around constantly thinking about how they're losing their kids because it hurts them right now. It feels really bad. It distracts them from building a life they actually enjoy. It can create this kind of desperation around the kids that can be unhealthy when in contact with the kids, if the kids are picking up on it, which they are because they're all telepathic. It's just bad all around to be living with this conviction that I'm losing my kids. Now, this is separate from maintaining the strong intention and motivation of continuing to improve the connection with the kids, having a better connection. Maybe that includes more time, maybe not. But these two can be separate. It's possible to orient and act with great intentionality toward having more connection with the kids while not being in panic about losing the kids forever.
Yeah.
And I'll also say, and this is a kind of a general formula about anything we're afraid of. I think being afraid of something that could happen is a huge waste of energy.
Right.
And typically when I find myself having these kinds of fears, I go through three steps. I tell myself, well, first of all, it may turn out differently than I think. And then I'm just wasting all of this fear. Maybe in 5 years, I will have a fantastic relationship with my kid and we'll be so well connected. And so who knows? So right now I'm just upset about what's going to happen in 5 years. And I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. So that's step one. Step two, it may be partially true, but it may not be as bad as I think. Like maybe we'll have just a fine connection and I'll be fine with it because I'll also be doing other things and it'll be an appropriate parent-child relationship and it's okay. And thirdly, if it does happen and if it's exactly as bad as I think, then I'll feel horrible about it then. I don't need to feel horrible about it now. It's gonna come. There's no need to borrow trouble from the future.
Yeah.
It just doesn't help. But the thing that's, I think, hardest for people about these kinds of things, people, myself included, is we have this concern, we have this belief that if we're not hugely negatively, emotionally impacted by something, we don't really care and we're not really going to be motivated to solve it. And I think it's just so important to remember that it's possible to care and work towards something without being completely consumed and overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, I hear you talking a lot about the narrative. And so you started this conversation with the fact is that most children, no matter our age, no matter how good or bad our parents are, we stay connected. That's a fact. That's something that has happened over the course of time. The fiction is it's not going to be for me. They're never going to, and I'm going to lose them. And so I hear you really delineating between that fear fiction and what has been. And then, even if it is so, right? I'm reading Gay Hendricks' Big Leap right now, and he
Mhm.
says, when you worry about something, just ask yourself, can I do something about it? And if I can't do anything about it right now, let it go. And if I can do it, let me do the thing I can do. And that's the other thing as you're talking. It's like, I can stay in communication. I can let them know how much I love them. I can do everything that I can do. And when crisis hits, I can face crisis. Much easier said than done. I work with a couple of parents who are struggling with parental alienation. And yet, even for them, it's like, what can you do? You can keep in touch, even if it's a one-way communication. You can keep sending out love, sending out connection, and just the shift in narrative, Iran, from I'm losing them to I have the ability to build and rebuild with them is just such an emotional, that's just such a lightening and a higher level feeling when you can focus on what you're capable of.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree 100%. We live a story in our head all the time. And we have a fair amount of control over the story. Not perfect, but we have a fair amount of control because we are the storyteller. And yeah, I think to be able to shift the narrative from, like you said, from I'm losing them to this is a period of less connection, for example, right? Think about our own lives. How many friends do we have who we've been in closer contact with for some time and less contact for others? How about our connection with our own parents? And think about the phases that it's gone through, and sometimes more, sometimes less. Just start bringing in additional reference points to recognize that this is not forever. Very few things are forever. This is not hopeless. This is not predetermined. There's so many ways that this can go, and our own intentionality and our own orientation are going to have such a big impact there. So yeah, being able to change that story is important, and we need other people often to help us change that story. That's okay. Connect with other people that can help you with that story.
Absolutely. Beautiful. We're not going to be able to dive into all five, but I would love to talk about the who am I and the self-worth issues. I have one client that comes to mind, a couple of decades of being married and just being told as a very successful and connected partner and dad, what a terrible parent he is and how incapable and useless he is. And having been in a fairly toxic marriage, it really can, it's like brainwashing. After a while, you just believe what you're being told. And so here you have these dads, okay, in regular divorce and in high conflict divorce. And you're saying the two things that I heard you say was the negative messaging, and then the if I'm not the head of my household, if I'm not the husband, And dad, well, then who the heck am I? Can we just dive into those two a little bit?
Yeah. If I am not for them, who am I?
So, the other thing I'd like to focus on, Iran, is the negative messaging and the
Yeah.
impact that has on dads. And then that piece that you talked about, which is if I'm no longer the head of the house, who am I?
Yeah.
Those two, I think I'd love to dive into a little bit.
Okay. Just to hear more thoughts about. We talked about how for many men, the home relationship, the relationship with the spouse, the relationship with the kids are really the primary emotional connections that exist in life. And very often, these are the people that we go to for emotional comfort, maybe not so much leaning on kids for comfort, but certainly drawing a lot of comfort from the relationship with the kids. And yes, going to the spouse for emotional comfort and disclosure and talking about the deepest, darkest, and all of that, at least for a good long part of the relationship, maybe all the way through to the end. To have a person who, up until a short while ago, was our confidant, turn around and tell us that we're a very bad person can be devastating because presumably they know us best.
And
And so
now
for
they
the,
know all our dirty, dark secrets too, because we've
yeah,
been vulnerable with them.
yeah, and we'll point them out as needed and sometimes as not. And just the sense of, okay, this person knows me best and this person thinks I'm horrible can be devastating, right? Is everybody else that knows me actually deceived, right? Did I manage to make somehow other people think that I'm a good person, but really I'm not because this one person who knows me really well tells me that I'm not. I think can be very, very destabilizing, especially if there are not other people who we feel know us. Then maybe it's like the only person who knows me really well says to me that I'm a bad person. That can be really crushing. With respect to the identity of, yeah, what do I do if I'm not part of this household, I think is a very real sort of almost logistical question. There's a default schedule when you're in a marriage and a parent, right? A lot of your time is taken up by that. And at the beginning, I would say the first probably year to 2 years, it's very hard for people to think about the space that opened up as anything but vacuum, feeling like they're just in free fall through outer space. Later on, people realize, oh, I have all this free time now. And then they start doing stuff with it and realize that it's actually the other side of the coin that sorry, realizing that it's actually this other side of the coin that is the part of the experience to focus on. I have a lot of free time now and I can do all these cool things, but it doesn't change the fact that maybe you're coming home to an empty place now. There's not the noise and comfort of a family. And then there's the question of meaning. If you are the kind of person who works at a job out of a sense of responsibility because you want to provide for your family and your job is acceptable to you, but not more than that, and then suddenly there's not a family to provide for, or there's a family to provide for, even though you disagree with the concept, like if you think that your ex is getting a lot of child support money out of you, or took a lot of your money in the agreement or court decision or what have you, again, however you're telling yourself this story, now you might be feeling like, oh, I'm really working for this other person that I don't agree with. I'm working for my ex now, who's taking a lot of my money in a way that's not fair and so on. And then work becomes potentially less satisfying or less meaningful if most of the meaning before was about providing for your family, providing for your spouse and kids. Now this can become very, very bitter. So yeah, what do I do with myself is a big question. How is work fair now becomes a big question, and what is happening in terms of money. These again are all things that are really destabilizing, especially for people who primarily have their life built on doing work and then coming home and being with a family.
Yeah, it's really quite the rug being pulled out from underneath when that's such a primary focus. How do you work with men? Do you do one-on-one? Do you have groups? Do you have programs? Is it just the website? How does that work?
The website has a bunch of content on it, and some of it is on like YouTube or whatnot. People find it there. I run groups for men to meet and talk. They're not supposed to be complaint sessions, but it's just, yes, for mutual support. We're often able to remind other people of things that are hard for us to remember, and in the process, remind ourselves. about the same thing. Sometimes individually, if it seems warranted. When I work with people individually, I ask to record the conversations and then we de-identify the person. So we send the recording to an actor who then reads it in his own voice. We change names, we change location, and that becomes part of the podcast. So then people can hear experiences of other people who've gone through this process and get a sense of how this plays out.
I
Um,
was listening to your podcast. I was
oh,
wondering if those were real clients or so that's interesting. So you have an
yeah.
actor who basically takes that reality and just de-identifies it is a great way. And
Yeah, yeah.
then
Rereading, not even reading. The actor listens in one ear to the original dad talking and then just says it again, just in the actor's voice. Same words, same content. It's not even based on a true story. It's exactly the true story, just having another person read it in order to protect the privacy of the family,
that's
especially
brilliant.
the kids involved.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
love that. Yeah, that's great.
Um, so these are all the ways. The website is divorcingdads.org, and then everything is on there. People can find everything else from there. The podcast is called Divorcing Dads. It's all very obvious.
Yeah, beautiful. On the one more tip before we just say goodbye, on the negative messaging where somebody begins to believe what's being said about them or begins to doubt what they thought they knew about themselves. What's the tip or the strategy that you could leave our listeners with around that?
Talk to other people. Just talk to friends, talk to family, get therapy, talk to Karen McMahon, talk to whoever you need to. Find a support group, talk to your pastor or rabbi or imam or whoever is around in your spiritual neighborhood. Talk to other people. You need more voices in your head. You need to triangulate yourself, right? You can't get a good read on yourself just from a single source of information. Talk to other people. That's by far and away the most important. Also, in this vein, I want to remind people of this amazing service that we're all paying for, and few of us are using 988. So the National Crisis and Suicide Prevention Line. If you call 988 from any phone, anywhere in the US, you're going to get connected 24/7 to live confidential counseling. It's not meant for long-term therapy. Well, you can call whenever you're upset. You don't need to be even suicidal. You can also call if you're worried about somebody else. They're amazing people there. They're very well trained. They're caring and empathetic, and they're waiting for you. And you're paying for it. Your taxes are funding it, so you may as well use it. So if you're upset anytime, you wake up at 4 a.m. and your friends are probably sleeping, call 988 if you're really upset. 988. So tip number one, talk to other people. Tip number two, which hopefully other people will tell you to do as well, is just review the facts. Somebody told you you're a horrible, mean person who never does anything nice. Say, okay, what nice things have I done in the past year to anyone? Is there anybody who thinks I am nice? Sure, my mom. Great. Okay. Why does she think I'm nice? Well, I did help her move with the thing. Well, yeah, but she's my mom. Okay. Did I help anyone else move? Like you can go through this process. But again, it's hard to do it on our own when we have such a strong negative voice in our head and in our ear. Talk to other people. By far and away the most important thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a program called Reclaim Your Mind, Evict Your Spouse from Your Mental Space. And one of the modules in it is as soon as he or she leaves, your inner critic comes swooping in with an even louder amplifier, right? And so I completely agree with you. That external sounding board of people who know you and care about you is vitally important. This has been a great conversation. I so appreciate you coming on and sharing with me and the listeners.
Yeah, my great pleasure. Thank you. I really enjoyed it too. There's so much to talk about.
Yes, we barely scratched the surface, but this is what we have for you today. And
Yeah.
if you enjoyed the conversation, please check out Divorcing Dads podcast, divorcingdads.org, and the group that Eran has for men, which might be particularly interesting for you. And everything is in the show notes, so you didn't have to remember everything. Just go there and click. And Ron, again, thank you so very much for what you're doing in the world, for all of the men that you're helping, and for showing up and sharing with our audience.
My pleasure. Likewise for you. Thank you for this really incredible work that you're doing. I think it's very meaningful to have at this juncture in life an empathetic, insightful, experienced, caring woman who's willing to say, you're not a bad person, and doesn't mean that your ex is evil, but like you're okay and you're a good, worthwhile person. I think it's amazing that you exist. I'm really happy for all the people going through a hard time that can contact you and get your help.
Thank you so much. I raised my kids on what you say, and what comes out of your mouth is about you, and your behavior is about you, and what comes out of their mouth is about them, and their behavior is about them. And if you could just hold on to that, life will be a lot easier.
Amazing. Amen.
Amen. Okay, we'll be back again real soon. Until then, you take care. Thanks for joining us on the Journey Beyond Divorce podcast. I hope you found guidance and encouragement to help you along your journey. If you like my podcast, please take a minute to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. You can also visit us at jbddivorcesupport.com, where our team of coaches support both men and women through our one-on-one coaching, group programs, online courses, and free resources. Stay tuned for our next episode, and I'll talk to you soon.